Oh, it's a very good evening to everybody. Time again for Candid Conversations from Lockdown with myself, Aidan. Don't forget that these episodes are brought to you by Kyalami Park Equestrian in association with Equipage, a division of Hollard. Equipage are also getting behind our competitions. We do hope that you have submitted your Hobby Horse Derby Challenge competition as well as your Kent Farrington Skipping Challenge videos. Those videos to be sent to admin at Kyalami Park club.co.za. Closing deadline tomorrow, Monday morning at 9 o'clock. We'll then spend the next 2 days just uploading them to our YouTube channel. So remember, it's most likes on YouTube, not Facebook, but YouTube only. That counts. So all those videos will be uploaded come Wednesday morning, and then they will be on YouTube, and the voting starts on Wednesday all the way through to the following Monday morning. So come midnight, Sunday the 10th, I think it is. That's when voting will stop. And come the following Monday, Monday the 11th, is when we will announce the winner. And remember, the most likes on YouTube for both of those videos, Kent Farrington Skipping as well as the Hobby Horse Derby Challenge, will walk away with the prize money. And of course, not prize money not to be sneezed at. 5,000 Rand up for grabs for the Hobby Horse Derby competition, and then 2,000 Rand for the Kent Farrington Skipping Challenge. Enough of that. Let's get into our conversation for this evening. And it's a great privilege for me to speak to our guest this evening. Her name has been mentioned by many of our guests who I've already interviewed as the most competitive rider on the circuit in her day. They said if there was one person to beat, it was always this person. And of course, I'm speaking about the legendary Anneli Wucherpfennig. Anneli, how are you? Very good evening.
Oh, I hope I live up to all that praise. No, I'm fine.
You have already lived up to all the praise. We're looking back on an extraordinary career, an extraordinary life, and as I say, it's a great privilege for me to speak to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I never look backwards, but I always look forwards. So I don't see myself like that. But anyway.
Well, we want to know about this extraordinary life with horses that you have had. We'll get to that, but first of all, we want to know how you're holding up in lockdown. A lot of people are going a little bit stir crazy. Where are you, and where's your head at?
Well, I live in a complex in Lone Hill, and my horses are about 6 kilometers away. But sadly, I can't see them. And luckily, I've got good grooms. I keep in contact. But they have to do without me, which has been now about 4 weeks, I suppose, even 5 weeks. I'm lost count of the time. And it's the same for everybody. I used to keep my horses at home, but now I keep them in a stable, but I'm not allowed to travel. So we are literally locked down. So I'm just living from one meal to the next, playing with my cat. And
tell me, in normal times, pre-COVID, how much riding are you doing these days? Are you still very active?
I am theoretically. I've got 6 horses. I don't quite ride 6 a day, but I sort of ride 4. And I bring on young horses. I buy horses off the track and put them into shape, hopefully. And I'm not as agile as I used to be, but I still keep going. And I've got one horse which I compete with when I feel like it. And I don't jump big stuff anymore, but I sort of do the medium stuff. And we toddle around and do what we can.
And are you still you still love it as much as you ever did?
Probably not. Probably not. Age catches up with you a little bit, and it's not quite as easy now. But I don't sort of really allow myself to get too ancient, because I don't sort of see myself like that. In fact, I've never stopped riding except for this last few weeks. I've never stopped riding in my whole life, so I've always kept going. And so somehow or other things haven't sort of got on top of me, but I don't know what's going to happen now after this lockdown. Maybe I would have forgotten how to ride.
Never, never. Are you saying that at this 5 or 6 or 7, we lose count how many weeks we have been locked up, has been the longest time in your career since you started as a young
Yeah,
girl that you have been away from your horses and out of the saddle.
for sure. For sure. I've never been as long out of the saddle. So I'm just sort of telling myself that I'm just one of many. So I try not to get too sort of depressed about it. I'm just having to go along with what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Mm. Well, let's talk about this extraordinary career that you have had in the saddle and how it all started. Take us right back to the beginning, where you were born, how it all came about. Were you introduced to your horses from your parents, or are you first generation? I want to hear, in your words, the whole story, as do your legions of fans out there.
Have you got a long time?
We have got a long time. Take your time. We want to hear it all.
It seems like I've been going a long time, but I was born just before the war, and not that I remember the war times really, but according to what I'm told, I was about 2.5 when the war broke out, and everything came to a full stop, and life just changed dramatically, rather like we are now today. And my mother she ran a polo club. So I believe, I didn't know it, but she ran a polo club before the war. She was the daughter of a duke, so I sort of come from titled background, and she got married to my father when he was quite young, and well, they were both very young. He was a Scottish nobleman also, and I believe in the sort of young days of their marriage, they had plenty of money, which came from whatever their estate or whatever, but they didn't have any idea about how to not lose it all. And I think by the time the war broke out, my mother had spent all her bits of wealth, and my father had too. But she did have a polo club, which she ran, a very upmarket polo club, and she had an Argentinian polo trainer for the ponies, plus Argentinian ponies. So it must have been a very sort of grand situation. And then when the war came, all these ponies became redundant and of no use to anybody. And I believe the government rule was that if you had a horse, you had to sell it to the army to be used for the war. Mm. So the majority of these polo ponies got snapped up by the government for going to fight the war. But there was, as far as I can sort of, what I'm told, there was one old one which was Argentinian. It was called Independencia, as far as I remember. And it was old and a bit crippled probably. And it was kept for me, well, not for me, but I rode it. And so I spent my whole of my sort of pre-riding days on this polo pony. As soon as my mother could put this child on the pony's back, and she would leave me there all day, and it was like a nanny to me. And I think the interesting thing is that I never rode with a saddle, and because of the Argentinian training, the ponies were ridden and trained in a bit called a bocado, which was a rawhide thong tied around the bottom jaw, and the ponies all neck reined. They were all obviously sort of hollow and above the bit, if you want to use dressage terms, but they were light and balanced and terribly sensitive. And as soon as you wanted to turn, they were sort of like silk. And that was my basis for riding without a saddle. And it taught me to have a firm seat, a secure seat, and absolutely no support from the contact. And the reins, you put them over the front of your hand, not in the conventional way like nowadays. So everything was terribly sensitive and light. In fact, like you see cowboys riding on a film. And basically on a loose rein, and turning obviously with the wrong bend, but a much faster turn because of the the horses were polo ponies.
Mm.
And I think in hindsight, it probably was a wonderful grounding for me, because I learned how to have a secure seat without any help from contact, and to ride sensitive horse or pony or whatever, and not manhandle it, and have a fistful of contact and that sort of thing. And I think I was, although it was out of line with dressage schooling, I think it helped me to have maybe more of a sensitive feeling for my horse, and not resort to strong contact and having a double handful and that sort of thing.
Mm.
It was quite
And
interesting.
how old were you at this stage, and where, may I ask, was the polo club?
It was in Shaftesbury in Dorset in England, and because my father had inherited a family estate in Scotland, but he couldn't move there because his mother was still living there, so he had to wait until she died off, which was a bit horrible, but anyway. So we lived in my mother's family's place in Dorset, and my mother always had horses. She wasn't a particularly good rider herself, but she was a sort of gang-ho rider, and she used to play polo. And I think she used to go hunting a bit too. And I think she actually, from what I hear, she used to ride in point-to-points before the war with her sister, who was a better rider than her. And they rode in point-to-points side saddle. Can you believe it? Flat out. So, I mean, if you had a fall, it wasn't very pretty. I know my mother told me that her sister was riding in one point-to-point, and a boyfriend was girthing up her side saddle, and he hadn't done it properly. And halfway around the race, the side saddle slipped. And I think that was the end of that relationship.
I wasn't aware that they even did that sort of thing. How old were you at the time when you were first put onto this polo pony? And was this the early years of the war, and this went right through the war?
Yeah, I was born in 1937, giving my age, but anyway, what does it matter now? And so the war broke out about 2 years later, and I just was continually on this polo pony without a saddle. And my mother had the polo pony instead of a nanny, I think. And I mean, in hindsight, I shudder really, because my mother was, she wasn't very motherly really. She didn't sort of tend to us very much. She just let us get on with it. And I couldn't read or write until I was 9. I mean, the education didn't come into it. And somehow or other, it was, I did feel a bit awkward when I got with other kids later on, when they could read and write and I couldn't. But I think it was the way that the war was sort of panned out. Education somehow or other didn't seem to matter.
And did you have siblings? Were there brothers and sisters, and did they share the love of horses?
Yeah, there were 7 of us. My older sister, she was a good rider, but she was more social than me, and she rode competitively for a few years, and then nearly won badminton right at the beginning. And then she found a boyfriend who she married, and that was that. So I sort of started, I mean, I actually started young also, because we actually moved to Scotland after the war when my father's mother died, and this estate was there for him to take over. It was in Perthshire, and I obviously can't remember very much about it, but I do remember being freezing cold because there was no electricity in Scotland in those days, and this is a big sort of castle-like estate, and full of ghosts and cold things, and I remember being freezing. And it was, houses like that were meant to be run with staff and servants, and of course after the war that sort of thing didn't happen anymore, so we had to get on and do it ourselves, which was hideous. I can just remember spending most of the day cleaning out fireplaces or trying to clean the house or wash up, or I don't know, just all the things that, and in this huge mansion, I didn't like it very much. My mother wasn't very good at organizing things like food, and so we didn't sort of sit down and have meals properly together. And but it was okay for me because I didn't actually like food very much, so I'd sort of. But it was a strange upbringing when I look back on it, because I was very much left on to do my own thing, but there were always ponies there, ponies and horses. So I was very unsociable, and I just buried myself in the horses and ponies. But my mother was, I think because she had so many children, she decided to have a school at the house, at home, rather than us be sent to school. So there were about 5 or 6 children, I think, came in and used to, I think they were weekly boarders or something. So, and the governess was there who had to teach everything. And I mean, I used to learn for about 2 hours in the morning and then go off and ride. It was terribly unprofessional, perhaps is the right way. I mean, I could just learn to read and write, but not much more. It was terrible, but my mother didn't seem to mind. I mean, she didn't take much notice of us anyway. So.
And were you the only child that was riding? I mean, I'm picturing the scene, and it's almost like an Edwardian novel or some kind of movie script, with this misty manor on the moors and the ponies running around, and you absconding from schoolwork to go and ride these ponies off into the mist. Have I got it kind of right?
Funnily enough, you have, in a funny sort of way. My mother was, she was, I mean, she was a very good mother, but she really didn't notice what we were doing. And so I was totally let on a free rein. And it's true, I mean, I used to do the minimal possible in my lessons, but then I used to escape. And I remember I had a fight with her one day. She was quite sort of strict and bossy in some ways and impossible in other ways. And I had this bitter fight, which could happen quite often. And I don't know how old I was. I was probably about 11 or 12 or something. And I had a pony called Spider. I adored it. And I decided to run away from home. Don't ask me what I was going to do, but anyway, that was my little thoughts at the time. So I got on my pony and I rode up into the moors, into the hills, which was right behind the house, up in the heather and everything. I suppose it must have been summer. And I slept out for 2 nights with the pony. And I remember I took a bag of apples. That was because we had an orchard there which I could get apples from. And then I came back 2 days later. Nobody had even noticed I'd gone.
Oh.
So it was a complete waste of time.
You were trying to make a statement and it wasn't punctuated.
No, it was terrible. It was such a waste of time. But anyway, it was.
And how long? Well, you tell me what happened next. How long were you at this manor house, and how did the riding progress? How did you eventually leave? Where did you go?
Well, I'd always had the ponies, and my mother, funnily enough, she was supportive in that she somehow organized for us to ride in weekend shows. And there were quite a lot of shows that, we were in Scotland now, quite a lot of shows that took place on a weekend. They were usually about an hour and a half away or whatever. And there was a truck that could sort of take us there. It was a kind of a cattle truck. I don't know. It was a very friendly driver, I can remember, but I don't know. She sort of organized that side of it. So we used to go off. I say we. I think there were some kids from the school that went on ponies or whatever. I don't really remember the details, but I just remember that the shows, they did everything. You had showing, you had jumping, and then you had gymkhana events. And I had one pony, and the one pony did everything all day long. And then at the end of the day, they used to, especially the shows near Glasgow, because they were very sort of, there were a lot of miners used to come and watch. and they loved to bet. So they used to have what they called flapping racing, which is highly illegal. And if you were found to have been a rider in a flapping race, you were never allowed to ride in a point-to-point afterwards. But I didn't ride a point-to-point, so it didn't affect me. But it was illegal. And even my mother wouldn't have allowed it. But when she didn't come to the shows, which was most of the time, I used to ride in these flapping races. And it used to be quite good prize money. I mean, they used to be like given £3 to the winner and things like that. And it was, in those days, it was quite a lot. And I had this 12-2 sort of half Shetland pony, and he was amazing. His father was a thoroughbred, so he was very, very thoroughbredy, and he was very fast. And I used to get given a start in these races, and these sort of minor type ruffians were riding thrown out little thoroughbreds. And the first race, I
sorry, and they gave you a start. Why? Because of your age, or because?
Me and we were both so small.
Oh, okay. How much of a start did they give you?
Oh, only about 20 meters or something. We were just like, it was, and terrible courses. I mean, it was on cinder and very sharp bends and flat out. But anyway, my mother wouldn't have let me do it, but I did it.
And you won a few Bob prize money. Did you win a few of them?
Absolutely, I did. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. And was there any formal training or any coaching back then, or was it just you learnt it yourself by a feel, and riding that polo pony bareback gave you the seat and the balance, and you were on your own to figure it out?
I think that's the main thing is I learned the balance and the feel and whatever. And the polo pony training, of course, it taught me to ride with my legs and my body without the contact. Well, the contact sort of wasn't the important thing. It was the balance of the horse. And then they started what they call the Pony Club. What was it called? It was a Pony Club interbranch competition, and it was all very new. And Perth formed its own pony club, and there were only 3 members in it: my sister, me, and somebody else. And my mother had entered us into the interbranch competition, and it was all pony club. And how it worked is that I think there were about 3 or 4 pony clubs in Scotland. They all came into a sort of final, and Perth won it. The others were absolutely useless. And then the first year, the 3 of us had to go down to England to a place called Newmarket, where all the racehorses are, where the finals were. And I can remember, I mean, in those days, we didn't have horse boxes on the road. The horses travelled by train. So we shoved these ponies on the train, and then we came out the other end. And I mean, amazingly, we came second as a team. I can't think how bad the others must have been, and I was on my 12-2 pony. And the first year I did it, I was 11. So and you went along. It was actually quite interesting in hindsight. You had to ride a dressage test, and then you went out of the arena and had to jump about 6 show jumps on a course around the outside of the dressage ring. And then you had to gallop around the outside flat out and stop and drop your reins, and that was it. Well, of course, having to ride the dressage test, you weren't allowed to carry a stick. And my pony was quite cheeky. He needed a stick to encourage him because he could have a stop at the jumps. And he was, I can remember going into these jumps, having to hit him with the end of my reins to try to avoid this dreadful stop. Somehow or other we managed, because you weren't judged on style, not for the jumping, only the dressage. And so we sort of survived. And that was my first thing when I was 11. So, and then I think I went on competing on a yearly basis in the Pony Club Championship, as it was called. And finally, I think I won it when I was about 15 or 16. But not on the same pony, obviously, something else.
Yeah. And schooling then, I've got a feeling Were you shipped off to boarding school at some stage? Was that the done thing, or did you continue your schooling under the governess at home?
No, my mother tried to send me to the boarding school where she had been sort of 100 years earlier, and it was in London. And I absolutely couldn't stand being in a town, and I absolutely was so out of my depth at a boarding school because all the girls were so sort of sophisticated and properly dressed and knew how to behave and whatever else, and I was absolutely so green. I hated it. And my mother, to give her a due, she took me out of the school. I think I spent half a term there, and that was it. So after that, I was educated at home and cheating dreadfully, but I did take a school certificate, which was sort of the entrance exam you had to take to get into university. And I cheated dreadfully in the exam. I remember I was sitting next to, it was a double desk in the exam room, and I kept looking over at my shoulder at my next door neighbour, what he was filling in the form and everything. But somehow or other we scraped through.
Yeah. So, Emily, during these years in Scotland, were there any formal competitions that you were going to other than the pony club, or was it mostly just these pony club competitions and gymkhanas?
Well, see, don't forget, with this sort of upbringing that I had, I was sort of destined to be a debutante and a lady and do all the right things and, you know, sort of fit into society in the way that my mother had. But I didn't, because I'd had the war to contend with, so I actually hadn't learned how to talk to anybody. I spoke to the postman, and that was about it. So I was absolutely out of my depth in any kind of a social situation. So I know my mother at one stage, she wanted me to be a school teacher, and I absolutely couldn't bear the thought of that. That absolutely sent me flying. And I was quite good at playing the piano. And I don't know how it worked quite, but there's a big thing every year in Scotland called the Edinburgh Festival. And I played in that. I really don't know why I was chosen to play, but I don't know. Anyway, I did. And then as a result of doing sort of quite successfully in that, I thought I would go to university and study piano playing. And my older brother had done university in Toronto. He was about 6 years older than me, so we weren't that close, but I admired the fact that he'd gone and done this, and I thought, well, I think this is probably what I must do, because in those days women didn't do horses, you know. It wasn't a career for them. It was a sideline, and I couldn't think of myself making horses a career. So that was my destination. And then my older sister, she was about 7 years older than me, she had ridden at badminton very successfully on a horse that my mother had found for her, which must have been a most wonderful horse in hindsight. And with comparatively little training, she rode it at badminton and came second. And I was watching it when I was sort of about 13 or 14 or whatever, and I was totally inspired by this. And I thought this would be a wonderful thing to do, but you couldn't think of it as being a career. It was it was a luxury, really. So that was in the back of my mind. But then when I was 16, I think, some distant relatives asked my older sister, who had ridden at badminton successfully, if they had a horse which they would like her to ride at the coming European Championship, which was held at Windsor Park, the first and the last. And my sister couldn't do it because she was getting married and she was going off to, well, she was doing married things. But she said, why don't you ask my younger sister? She might like to be able to do it. So they asked me, and of course I jumped at the chance, and which was I mean, a wonderful opportunity. But of course, they didn't realize it, and I wasn't aware. You had to be 18 to ride in an international class. So I was technically too young. But I didn't actually know this until about 3 or 4 days before the event, where I sort of read the program and saw that I was too young. But anyway, that's another story. Mm. And this horse was under the guidance of a famous trainer of the day called Robert Hall. And he had a big place just outside London where the horse was. So I had to go and stay there for 3 months to train with him in preparation for the European Championship at Windsor. Now, there was no qualification. You just entered. And I'd only ridden in pony club things. Mm. And the European Championship was quite like going sort of from pony club to the Olympic Games. And it was a pretty heavy task. And of course, I didn't realize it. I mean, I was always keen to try and do things, but I didn't realize what I was undertaking. And in hindsight, he was absolutely mad. I would never do it today. This horse that I went to ride, it had a wonderful heart, wonderful courage, but it was very unsound. And so I couldn't jump it because every time I jumped it, it used to go lame. Mm. But I could school it in dressage, which wasn't particularly good, but it had a good training. So I was told to give it lots of walking on the hard road. So I used to walk it for 4 or 5 hours a day. That was it. I didn't do any fast work at all because it went lame. So we arrived at Windsor, and I think there were about 80 starters in it. It was a big international from all over the continent, and across country. Robert Hall, my trainer, or sort of trainer of the horse, he walked. We had in those days the 3-day event was about 4 kilometers of roads and tracks, and then it's actually I think a bit more than that, but anyway, about 3 kilometers of steeplechase, which had to be run at the average speed of what the Grand Nationals run at, and then about 9 or 10 kilometers of more roads and tracks, and then 5+ kilometers of the cross country, and then another kilometer just to finish up. So it was a hefty thing. Now this horse that was always lame I was going to take on this. So Robert Hall walked the steeplechase with me, and he said, well, don't bother walking the cross country because she'll be lame. Well, luckily I did walk the cross country, but he didn't walk with me. It was absolutely huge. I mean, I suppose I was young and foolish in those days, but I mean, it was huge. Anyway, this horse had an amazing heart, and after the steeplechase, she wasn't lame, so we kept going, and we come to the cross country, and we jumped around, and there was me, sort of a skinny 16, or I was just gone 17-year-old. And she actually jumped the course clear. Only 3 horses jumped the horse clear. But they were totally ignorant. I mean, I was just, it was amazing.
Wait, I just need to put this into perspective. So what you've told me,
yes.
You're a young 16-year-old girl who goes to a championship having given a horse that your sister was riding with no experience, completely green, no training, underage because you had to be 18. Somehow you get into the competition. Your trainer doesn't, part-time trainer, however, you've never jumped a cross-country track of those dimensions in your life. You've never been to a competition like this. And you're one of 3 horses in a field of 80 who go clear in a very challenging course, having never done it before, having had no formal training, and you jump clear. And the horse was always lame, so it didn't have any build-up or very little fitness, just mostly walking 5Ks, 4 or 5 hours a day on hard surfaces. Is that the story you've just told me? Because I'm battling to get my head around it.
It's ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, ignorance is bliss.
This is like This is like that. I'm just seeing a movie script like National Velvet with Liz Taylor going to the Grand National, sneaking in because she's female, having to be snuck in. That's what this is playing out like. Is this what you're telling me?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. It's. I mean, I was completely ignorant. And even I can remember one thing. I was going across in the second roads and tracks, which was the 10-kilometer one, and it wasn't very well signposted. It had little white flags, and you had to keep them on your left or wherever. And I ran out of flags, and there was a lady pushing a pram, and I said, "Which way? Which way is it?" And she said, "Where do you want to go to?"
The finish, the finish.
She hadn't a clue what was going on around her.
That is insane.
Yeah. No,
did they find out that you were underage?
Afterwards, I heard from a lot of the top riders that they knew I was underage, but they didn't say. I don't think it would happen today, but
Because they didn't think they, like your trainer, didn't think you'd get through the roads and track section, that you'd make it, so they didn't worry, but then you did.
no, they didn't. They just were good sports. They knew I was underage, but they just thought, well, I was, competitive and liked to compete, and they treated me like a child, which I was. But
Yeah, that's an insane story. Where did you finish up? Did you finish up? I mean, you were only one of three that went clear, so you had to be in the top three.
No, don't forget my dressage wasn't very good, and then my time wasn't very good because I wasn't sort of able to. So you lost a lot of points if you went within the time limit or whatever. I wasn't that slow. I think we finished up 16th overall. We actually jumped. The horse was still sound the next day, believe it or not, for the show jumping, and we jumped clear again. So I think the placing was 16. But don't forget, there were other. I had faults from not going fast enough, and my dressage wasn't that polished. But as a result of that, I was totally bitten by the bug. And I decided that's what my piano playing fell out of the window, and I was going to do horses, even though it wasn't really accepted for a girl like me to go and put her career into a horse, because it wasn't deemed to be a career in those days.
So tell me about the conversation you had with your mom when you went back and you said you were not going to be a debutante, you were rather going to ride horses professionally.
She didn't actually discuss it. She never. I mean, she wasn't a very motherly mother, and I don't recall ever discussing it. It just happened. And she looked after us, but she actually didn't care. For instance, we had 2 motor cars after the war. Old, I can't remember what they were, Hillmans or something, identical. I don't know why, but she let me drive the one around all down the roads and into our local town, which is Perth, and things like that. I was 12 years old, 13 years old. I drove everywhere for about, you could get your license when you were 16 in those days. So I drove everywhere for about 4 years without a license. And then when I went to get the license from the office in Perth, I drove in there, and the examiner failed me. And the reason was that I hadn't used my rear view mirror enough. So I was a bit miffed by this. So I got in the car and drove off. And then suddenly I realized it was illegal, because I had to have a person beside me if I was driving, who had a license, and I hadn't driven with the person beside me for at least 4 years.
Yeah.
But anyway, I suppose I was given a free rein.
Yeah, sounds like it a bit. And Anneli, you haven't mentioned your dad at all this time. What was he up to?
My father he owned the estate where we moved to after the war, and but he sort of played second fiddle to my mother, really, and they had a bit of a stormy marriage, but they stayed married for over 30 years. But I don't think he didn't really function much in my life. He didn't seem to like horses. My mother said he didn't like horses, and she used to be sort of secretive about if she got anything with the horses. He used to fight with her about it, I believe. So he didn't really function much, but he did sort of reappear in my life when I started to ride on the international circuit and sort of became more of a, what can I say, more of a name.
Mm.
So he started to acknowledge more that he was my father.
So after this competition as a 16-year-old, then what happened? The bug bites. Obviously, people noticed you. Did your coach, Mr. Hall, take you under his wing, or where did you move to then?
No. He wasn't really my coach. He happened to have trained the horse,
Yeah.
but he did guide me to riding in with a good basis. He'd learned from the Spanish riding school, so I had a rubble from that, and so I sort of learnt the correct way to get a horse round and on the corners and whatever. I mean, all the basic things that you should learn. No, I only didn't learn it properly, but I learned the sort of the start of it. No, he didn't follow up like that at all. And I came back to Scotland, and I had my sister had gone off to get married, and she had a 6-year-old, a rather sort of gawky Irish 6-year-old, which she'd bought and had lost interest in it and gone off to get married. So I was all inspired now with having ridden in the European Championship. So I took this 6-year-old over and decided I was going to make him into an event horse. And then I found in our local paper, a horse was advertised for sale. And somehow or other, the horse was amazing. I mean, he was standing in a stable. He'd been in the stable for 4 months, absolutely neglected. But he was the most magnificent horse. He was a thoroughbred. And he was very cheap. I mean, he was £12 or something. And so we got that, and I decided these 2 horses were going to be event horses. So I got my sister's horse. I rode it at Badminton the following year. It was by this time 7, and we actually came 3rd. So by this time I was 18. And
in the big class, in the big badminton class, in a year you produced the horse to go to the top level.
Yes, you didn't have to qualify in those days. You just entered. So ignorance is bliss. And so he came 3rd, and it was I was just trying to think, it was 1956, which was the Olympic year. And girls couldn't ride in the Olympics. It was they were the fair sex, and it was too dangerous for them. And so if a girl did well eventing, she was expected to lend her horse to a man who would then be able to ride at the Olympics. And so my horse coming 3rd was obviously of interest for the Olympic team. And I was asked to lend him. In fact, it was terrible because I had every cent that I possessed in this horse, and I didn't have anything left over at all. I was taken to an audience in Badminton House, and the Queen was there, and it was all terribly sort of grand and awkward making for me. I didn't know the Queen was going to be there, and the Duke of Beaufort said, we've come to say we'd want to borrow your horse for the Olympic Games. And I was totally mesmerized because of all this grand company, and it was terrible. And I wasn't, they sort of did it on purpose that I wouldn't be able to say no because the Queen was there and whatever. But somehow or other I stood up for myself and I said, no, I can't afford it. I've got every cent I ever had in this horse, and I can't afford to lend him to somebody to be broken or whatever. So there was a man in this sort of gathering where the Queen was who came forward and he said, well, I'll buy him for you and then lend him to the team. So I sold him, and that set me up financially a little bit.
Is this a conversation that everybody's listening to? In other words, I'm picturing a scene in a hall where they bring you in, and kind of in
It was terrible.
Movie type stuff as well. Will you lend your horse? And the Queen's watching, and you have to say, no, I will.
Yeah.
Is it that
The
kind of
Queen,
thing?
yeah, she didn't talk, obviously, but she was sitting there, and so it made
But she listened in on this conversation.
Yes,
It was for everybody's ears.
yes. It was sort of to try and, I suppose, demoralize me and make me subservient and say yes, sir, and of course, or whatever. And the Queen did already own a horse at that stage, which was being offered for the team, and I think she was more than interested in not buying my horse, but she was interested in the eventing. And yeah, luckily I sort of realized what was happening, and I stuck to my guns. So, but sadly I had to sell him, but it did set me up financially. I was able to do my own thing a bit more.
So the horse was sold to the Olympic team, and you then managed to set yourself up in a stable, or was this in England or Scotland, or?
No, it was in Scotland. My father's home that he'd inherited had a stable. I mean, a few stables attached to it, where I kept my horses. And but I used to go and stay with friends of friends or whatever, moving from one state or one competition to another. There were quite a lot of one-day events in those days. I think there still are. And I was, because of financial scarcity, I had to win, otherwise I couldn't eat. So it made me sort of very, very competitive. And so it sort of went on like that. And one sort of drifted a little bit, but I was very lucky because that horse set me up. And then I had trained a lot of horses, but they weren't that special. I bought one, which I call Perhaps, which I paid £15 for. I bought him as a 3-year-old, but unseen. Sounded all right, and they actually came from Cornwall, so he had to go on a overnight train to get to Perth. And this dreadfully thin, poor horse arrived, and he was absolutely too dreadful to look at. He was so thin, hence his name. And but anyway, I think he adored me because I'd sort of saved him from being put into the knackers yard. And I trained him to become an event horse, and he actually should have won badminton in, years are difficult, but I think 1960. Yeah, 1960 was the Olympic year again, and he should have won it. I was in the lead from the dressage and the cross country, and then he had a water jump in the show jumping in those days. It was so crazy because we'd had to jump into water the day before in the cross country, and then you had a water jump. And he put a foot on the tape, and so I lost winning, and I came third. But the first two were the Australians who went on to the Olympics, and they won the gold and silver medal. So I was third, but again, girls couldn't ride. So I wasn't eligible to go on the Olympic team. So he was bought by the Swiss Olympic Federation. And that again set me up financially a little bit. And I was able to sort of do my own thing. And that enabled me to sort of get involved with my horse that put me on the map, which was Merely a Monarch.
And at this stage, you're still based in Scotland at your father's place and training out of there?
Yes. Training was ridiculous. I mean, I had no facilities. We had a few show jumps in the paddock, but I mean, I had nobody to help me. And I don't know, I'm probably very old-fashioned, but I always think the best trainer is yourself. Because if you don't want to do it, it's up to you to put the effort in. And you ask the people you admire, and they can give you wisdom and guidance, hopefully. But it's actually...
Were you still there? Well, carry on with that thought before I ask you.
No, I was just saying it's actually you that's got to do it, not your trainer.
Yes. So you mentioned Me Earlier Monarch. How did the horse come into your life? Because that, as you say, was I mean, obviously you were already making a name, a third in badminton, and everybody knew this young English or Scottish lass who was coming on and producing these horses and making her way. But Me Earlier Monarch was really the horse that made your name.
He was head and shoulders better than anything I'd ridden before, but it was a fluke that I got him. I advertised in the Horse and Hound that I wanted a 4-year-old. Now, I had a bit of money from selling the horse called Perhaps. Not much, but a little bit. And I thought, well, I'll get my own young horse, 4-year-old, and train it, and hopefully things would go right. And I had about 100 answers. And one of them was for a horse that was 2. A lovely picture of it, photograph, but it was hopeless. I didn't want a 2-year-old. You can't do anything with a 2-year-old. So I sort of put it aside in the photograph to send back to the owner. And fortuitously, I lost the photo. Goodness knows why, but it's fate. And, or providence perhaps. About 6 months later, I still hadn't found a horse. And I was going to pack a bag to go and ride in a competition in the north of England. And there in my bag was the photo. And I looked at it again. By this time, the horse was 2.5. And I thought, gosh, it's a magnificent horse, this. And I looked at the back of the photo and had the address of where the horse was. And it was right next door to where I was going to compete. And I thought, I wonder if it's still around, because I needed a horse, but although he was young, but anyway, he was really a nice looking horse. So I phoned up the lady whose number was on the back of the photo, and I said, have you still got the horse? She said, yes, I have, as a matter of fact. So I said, well, I want to come and have a look at it, and so we'll be there in a few days. So I went off to Yorkshire and went and saw this horse that was in a paddock surrounded by barbed wire and filled with bottles and tin and whatever. But the horse was magnificent. He just had something about him. And I thought, that's the horse that's got to, I'm going to put my heart on it. And he was quite expensive, which I couldn't really afford, but it wasn't dreadful. He was £300. And of course, in hindsight, it was ridiculous, but he was unbroken and he was a sort of an uncut diamond. So I bought him, and his father was called Happy Monarch and his mother was called Amelia Minor, so hence his name. So when I gave him that name of Amelia Monarch, there was no choice. He had to be good.
And was he thoroughbred, or what were his lines?
His either great-grandmother or grandmother was a fell pony. Can you believe it? She was a hairy-heeled 14-hand pony, but he looked like a thoroughbred and moved like a thoroughbred. He was 17 hands, and you wouldn't have thought he wasn't a thoroughbred. He maybe had a touchful substance, but probably not thoroughbreds in those days. And he just had that sort of what we used to call the look of eagles. Mm-hmm. And he just was unbelievably talented. And sadly, the mother never had any more foals. I believe she was very difficult to get into foal, but she decided that she liked the father, which was Happy Bonnet, and had a foal, and that was it. Mm. So it was just fortuitous. It was my good luck.
Well, tell us the story about him. You got him as a 2-year-old and you produced him up. At what stage did you start hitting the competition circuit, and was he the superstar right from day one?
Yeah, he was. He was terribly naughty, bucked me off, difficult to break in. I used to long rein him a lot because he had a very strong mind that he didn't want to do things. For instance, we had what's called a burn in Scotland. It's a stream in England. And it was shallow, but it was one of the things the horses had to walk through it. No ways, he was not going to walk through this. But I was very brave, standing on the ground with long reins. I mean, I didn't care what he bucked or how he reared or whatever, or fly bucked. So, and you could sort of hold him straight, and he had to learn to do it. And then he used to, because he was so talented and so powerful, when I did come to riding him, he was full of joie de vivre. He would sometimes buck and twist and turn, and I'd go flying. But we survived. And then I got him up to competing at a show, and I rode him in a working hunter class in Scotland. And 3 people came up to me after that. In Scotland, there were only about 10 people watching, wanted to buy him. And that was the start of his life. Every time I rode him out, people wanted to buy him. I was besieged. And then I rode him, and because don't forget, my big thing in those days was eventing. So he had to be 5 in order to go and compete in an event. And so I rode him in a few one-day events. He did well, but I didn't necessarily go flat out in the cross country because he was still young. And then I was asked by a sort of distant relative to ride a horse for them, which was called O'Malley's Tango, at Burley. Was it Burley? Yes, it was Burley. And it was, that's right, it was a new 3-day event, never been held before. And it was lovely estate in the north of England. So I jumped at the chance, because anything that enabled me to ride in big events and that sort of thing. And they said, well, I had to go and train with, again, with Robert Hall, who'd had the mare, which I'd ridden at the European Championship. And so I said, I would like to take my young horse with me because he's coming on. And they said, no, that's fine. And the owners of this horse said, we'll pay for Merely Monarch as well. And you ride our horse. And so that was fine. But the horse they wanted me to ride he was quite willful. He was a thoroughbred, but he sort of a bit quirky. I didn't mind that. But the trainer had said that I had to ride him with I think it was he was mad about drop nosebands. And in those days, I was mad on Caveston nosebands. I didn't like strapping my mouth shut. It was just the way I was in those days. I mean, I'm more flexible nowadays. And we had an argument about it. And he said, no horse will leave this yard unless he's got a drop noseband. I said, well, I'm not riding him in drop noseband. So they said, okay, well, that's fine. I said, well, that's that. I'm not riding your horse. So that was the end of it. But the horse had been entered for Burley. And fortuitously, I had entered Merely a Monarch for Burley, but he was only 6 years old. And of course, there was no grading in those days. You just entered. And, you know, the jumps were whatever they were. So I thought, well, I'll ride Merely a Monarch. I'll be careful. Even though he wasn't probably ready, but I'll take him. I can't remember where I trained from or whether I stayed with Robert Hall or not. It slipped my mind. But anyway, I took Merely a Monarch there. And amazingly, I mean, he won the dressage easily because he was a magnificent horse. He had the most amazing movement. He took your breath away. And then in the cross country, he was, I was actually drawn last to go. Now this young horse of mine, I realized he was very extra special and I didn't want to hurt him. And I walked the course and my heart was in my mouth because there were some jumps in it that I'd never had to think about before. And my informer, don't forget the cross country was long in those days. It was all those different parts, so there's different sections. And I had an informer watching the cross country and they came back to where I was having a little bit of a break after the second roads and tracks. Said, bad news, the cross country is almost impossible. Every single horse has fallen. But in those days you could fall and get on again. But I didn't want to fall. And they said it's horrific, just be very careful. So anyway, I was sort of probably braver in those days than I am now. I set off and I was very careful. And he jumped clear. What? And it was so terrible. I mean, I was so ignorant, but anyway, ignorance is bliss, as they say.
And how old were you at this stage? Because the horse was 5. He was a 5-year-old.
No, he's just 6. Just 6.
6.
Yeah, just 6. But he had no
And how much experience had you had at that stage, and how much experience had he had?
No,
I
he'd
mean,
been
you had been producing horses and riding competitively, but not. I mean, you'd had a few big events, but again, you were still raw.
absolutely, absolutely. But I was quite brave, and I think I inspired my horses to be quite brave. And I'd ridden, I was counting it up the other day, I'd ridden about 40 different horses in events through my eventing career. So I think I'd ridden quite a lot of events, not big ones, one-day events, and some really not very nice horses as well. But they had to do the job because I had no choice.
And in that event, when your spotter came back and said everybody's falling, are you talking because of the dimensions of the fences, or was the ground cut up, or what was the story?
No, dimensions, and person rails on the edge of a cliff. And I remember there was a wall at the bottom of a sort of ravine where you would slither down the ravine and then had to slither up again. And it was, you couldn't jump from top to top because the ravine was too wide, and it was hard. And then there was a person rails into a pond, and they hadn't sort of got the ground right in the pond, and the horses were losing their footing in the pond. So I was told just, you must keep to the right or left-hand side, whatever it was, to keep out of this hole. That was another thing. But anyway, what I didn't want to do was to hurt my precious horse, which I didn't. And no, he was amazing.
And
So
in
of
the
course,
show jumping,
he was clear. He was always clear.
so you won.
Yeah, by record margin. But anyway, that was, and of course, then that was in the autumn, and then badminton was the following spring. So of course, he was entered for badminton, and I'd ridden at badminton about 7 or 8 times on various horses, but I'd never actually won it. No, not 7 or 8, but 6. And I had been placed. I'd been second, and I'd been third, and whatever, but I'd never won it. So I thought, now I've really got to win it. By this time, Miele Monarch was an A-grade show jumper, and I was starting to realize that his value was much too good to risk going around cross country and possibly hurting him. But I wanted to win badminton, so I just decided that was going to be his last event, and he had to win it, and then I would become a show jumper after that.
Well, tell us about badminton.
Well, badminton, I went. I mean, it sounds very blasé, but I didn't mean it like that. He won the dressage easily because he was such a gifted horse and floated through all the movements and everything. And then the cross country was clear, and steeplechase clear, and show jumping clear. He didn't really make mistakes. He was just amazing, and so we won it, and that was his swan song in eventing. And
So
then
he wins, and how old was he then? A 7-year-old now?
he was a 7-year-old. Yeah.
So he wins barely as a 6-year-old, goes up the grades into A grade. You're show jumping as well, goes to badminton, wins badminton as a 7-year-old, and then you retired him from eventing.
Well, yes, I did, but that was in the end of April, and in one's ignorance, of course, I entered him for the Royal International. You didn't have to qualify; you just entered, and I had so much confidence in this horse, despite my lack of experience for big jumps or A-grade jumps. I entered in the big classes, and the Royal International was in July. So badminton finished at the end of April, beginning of May, and so I had a couple of months to get myself sorted out and rode at the White City. And well, absolute ignorance. It was amazing. Everybody just fell down with their mouths open because they couldn't believe this horse. He was just out of this world. And the American team were there, and they just couldn't believe this horse. And of course they wanted to buy him. And people wanted to buy him all the time. And even one of the riders came and offered to marry me, so he could get the horse. I mean, jokingly, obviously, but but it was just my fault. I mean, it was my fault, my good fortune that I found this horse, and yeah, I had him, and I show jumped him then, I suppose, for trying to think, for about 8 years. Yeah, and then things started to go a bit wrong with his sinus and things like that.
And you haven't mentioned any trainers. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, because you did this all teaching yourself. The only trainer was that Robert Hall.
I suppose you're right. I suppose you're right. I asked.
Did you watch other people? Did you ask for advice?
Oh yes, yes.
I mean, there was no YouTube in those days.
No. I asked for advice, and I was and I watched the people I admired and tried to emulate them. And I think I was my own trainer, but I did ask advice all the time from people I admired. But I didn't actually have a trainer, which is pretty awful, really. But on the other hand, I don't know. You what I said earlier. You are your own trainer, and you've got to decide how.
But we're talking about dressage, that you have to. I mean, to win a dressage test at a Burley or badminton, you have to be a very skilled, polished equestrian. You can't just rock up. You can't just break rules like that.
No, but I'd watched, and
you watched.
I tried to ingest what I was watching, and and my older sister had the good fortune of going to the Spanish riding school for 6 months. I don't know how she got that invitation, but somewhere or other she was. And so a bit of her teaching from there rubbed off on me. Although she was quite a bossy, much older sister, but it did help me. So I don't know. And then I think I stayed with her and her new husband, or he wasn't so new then, for the few months before badminton. And she used to come and watch me working on the flat and sort of polish me up a bit and tell me my half passes were too acute or too whatever.
But I mean, essentially, you had to figure everything out, how to ride a half pass, how to get the horse to give you that movement, what was needed. That's all. You're saying that all just came naturally through feel and watching a few people. It's not meant to happen.
I think that you know, I don't know, nobody's ever asked me this before, but I think I did have a few sort of wise words every now and then from accomplished riders, but there was nobody. I mean, for instance, Nelson Pessoa, I watched him a lot, and I remember he said a few things that rang true, and I think I just watched, and yeah, I think I can't actually say anybody trained me. I was my own trainer, which goes against the grain because I want to train people, but.
Well, yes, that's what I'm saying. It's unreal. I can't. It's unbelievable. Anyway, back to Melia Monarch. Some of the big big names, the big competitions that you were at, were the Olympic Games. Were women allowed to ride now?
Well, ironically, I won badminton in when was it? 62. I'm trying to think. 62, and then 63. I was on the British Olympic show jumping team a year later, and at that stage, the Olympics changed the rule, and women could ride events. So I was asked, wouldn't I like to go back to eventing now that women were allowed? But of course, I'd broken into the show jumping world, and I couldn't go backwards because it was sort of wasn't a retrograde step, but it was, show jumping was more refined. It was a little bit like Formula One and racing. It was more refined. So I was stuck in the show jumping. So, but I'm trying to think. Gosh, that's a long time ago. 64 was the Olympic year, which was in Rome. I think, no, it wasn't. 64 was in Tokyo. Sorry. I was asked to go on the Olympic shortlist for show jumping. And don't forget, I really was very inexperienced. Although I'd ridden all my life, I was really show jumping inexperienced, but obviously accepted. And there was a man called Robert Hansen who, he was very wealthy, Haulier, I think, and he decided he wanted to own the Olympic show jumping team. And he already had bought a horse called Flanagan, which Pat Smythe, who was a sort of famous rider of her day, was riding. He was on the Olympic team, Olympic shortlist. He then went and bought another horse called O'Malley from Canada and gave it to Harvey Smith, and he was selected to be on the Olympic team. And then he came and he said, I want to buy merely a monarch, and you can stay riding the horse. And his idea was for the horse, that team, because there were only 3 in the team in those days, can you believe it? Mm-hmm. And he wanted to own the team. And he looked like he probably would, because they were the 3 best horses of that time. But the Olympic selectors, I mean, in hindsight, it was so idiotic. They kept putting us through these massive trials of Olympic, well, they were called Olympic trials, huge courses in various parts of England. And yeah, they were called Olympic trials. Well, consequently, these 3 superstar horses were so trialed out by the end of these trials that they were all, they couldn't do it anymore. They were all starting to break down and just not be the horses they were, because they were stretched too much. And the end of the story is that those 3 superstar horses never went to the Olympics. They selected 3 new horses that hadn't been to the trials at all, who were fresh and able to cope. Oh, no. But that was just a bit of a sad story. Yeah.
Ah. So did merely a monarch see the Olympics?
No.
I mean, he didn't see Tokyo. Was he around 4 years later?
Yeah, 4 years later, I was selected with him to go to Mexico. And again,
which was the big one. That's the famous one for show jumping.
No, not really. I mean, Tokyo was just as big, but yeah. Mexico was the 4 years later place of the Olympics, and I was selected, and sort of pretty hot favourite to go. But don't forget, in those days, with 3 on the team, not 4, 3. So if one of you had gonged out, the team had it. It was terribly cutthroat, and I was on the team until I suppose about a month before, and due to cutthroat people and me not standing up for my rights or whatever, somehow or other I'd lost staying on the team, and another horse came on, which really was hugely irritating, but there's nothing you could do. If you weren't selected, you weren't selected. But in hindsight, the horse that came on to replace me wasn't a horse at all. It was that pony Stroller, who was 14.3 with Marion Cokes, who was 21. And somehow or other, the selectors had decided that this was a better bet to go with than for me. So she was put in, and I was put off as a reserve. And I mean, I was absolutely furious. But she came through and she won the silver medal with this little tiny pony. It was amazing. So
how old were you at this stage, and was your horse coming towards the end of his career?
He went on jumping for another, I suppose another 2 or maybe 3 years after that, but he started to get a bit unsound. Yeah. And yeah, I suppose he'd had his main day. I was still competing a lot. I had other horses, and obviously he was the superstar.
Yeah. Some of the big titles that he won as a show jumper? Many.
many. Yeah, he took me all around the world. I mean, he won. I went to America with him, and I was invited to ride in the big winter circuit there, and they said they'd pay for me to come and flying him over and everything, which obviously was fantastic. But the proviso was that I had to pay for myself to go home. Well, anyway, I jumped at it because I thought, at least I can get to the shows. And there were 4 big indoor shows in Harrisburg, Washington, Madison Square Garden, and then finally in Toronto, all indoors, obviously. And he was the only horse I had, and he was amazing. But I couldn't crack a win. He had 14 second prizes. Just, it was unbelievable. He was second in the Grand Prix and second. And finally we came to Toronto, and the final event was the Grand Prix, and he won it. And I was just completely over emotional, burst into tears, and nobody could understand why, but I was so pent up.
Because you could get home.
Yeah, but it was an amazing experience.
And during this whole time, was your base still in Scotland at your home?
No, not really. I sort of moved around more in England because Scotland was a bit stuck away for going to shows and travelling. And it's not so bad now because the roads are good, but in those days they weren't so wonderful. So I used to base myself with various people in the middle of England or wherever, and I used to help train their horses or whatever sort of fitted in.
Mm.
And yeah, I suppose I lived a bit of a gypsy life, but it was quite glamorous also.
Mm. Well, I think that is the life of a show jumper. Regardless, you are on the road all the time. And the finances behind it, was it all just from prize money and winnings? Is that how you and producing and selling horses? I mean, were there any big backers funding you?
No, it was dreadful. I did get a big sponsorship from Ford Motor Company, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying this, I was the first rider to ever get a commercial sponsorship from a commercial firm. And it had obviously never been done before. And Ford approached me and said, "Would I be interested?" And so obviously I jumped at it. And they said, "Well, the proviso is that you have to find an unknown horse that's not known in the media, and that horse has to go to the Olympics 2 years later." It was quite a tall order. And we're prepared to pay up to £20,000 to buy it. And it was quite a handy amount, but it wasn't absolutely massive. It would buy a sort of a good B grade, but not a going A grade. So anyway, I had a good contact in the horse sort of dealing world, and I found a good B grade horse, which they bought for me to ride. And to me, looked like he would be Olympic material. And he certainly had the scope, and he had the courage, and he wasn't spooky, wasn't quite careful enough, but the other things were there. And Ford Motor Company called him Sporting Ford. And while I was competing on this horse, there was the high jump competition put in to the British calendar, and I entered this horse into that event. And it was big prize money. It was £1,000 to the winner, which in those days was like 100,000 today. And I rode the horse in, and he actually broke the high jump record for Britain, which was 2 meters 37, which was hideous.
Was it puissance or those sloping poles?
Sloping. He actually fell down on landing because it was so high. So, I mean, I would never do it today, but it was, anyway, we did do it.
2 meters 37 and you broke the world record. And how long did you hold that for?
Well, it wasn't recognized as a world record because there wasn't somebody there to take the records or whatever. It was
come on.
So it was never official, but it certainly is a record. And you know, it's one of those stupid petty things. But
Well, I don't know. I don't think it's petty. If I'd broken a world record and nobody recognized it, I wouldn't think it's petty. I'd be pretty pissed, actually. Oh
uh,
my word! I mean, you see that that clip of a young Nick Skelton on the grey breaking the world record, but I don't think that was as high. I think that
no, I
was
don't
too.
think it was. I think it was about 2 centimeters lower. That was on a horse called Lastic. But you know,
Skelton's was lower than yours, or yours
I
was lower.
think so, slightly, just minimal. But of course, nothing was stabilized in those days. And
So what are you saying to me, that actually you still hold the world record at 2:37 for sloping poles, but nobody recognized
yeah, yeah. Certainly, it certainly hasn't been exceeded by a woman. But I think it was also men as well. But it's quite a stupid thing to do, because you go on asking and asking until you break the horse. And it was, in hindsight, I would never have done it with a horse that was of more value. But this horse I rode for Ford, it was terribly brave, but not terribly careful, although he had Olympic material in him, but he wasn't really a winner. And I thought, well, if I can win this competition, it'll keep Ford Motor Company happy, which they were. And then, of course, the Olympics brought in a rule that no horse with a commercial name could compete. So that was the end of my Ford Motor Company sponsorship, because the whole reason for them being involved with him was to go to the Olympics. So that was quite sad. But anyway, it lasted for 3 years.
So up until this time, had you had the opportunity as yet to ride at the Olympics, or there were these 3 Olympic games that all went poorly? That the first one, there's the one with Stroller came in your team, and now this one, all by the wayside.
They all were. It's very strange. I mean, I've actually had a bad luck story with the Olympics, because either I was in the wrong discipline, or I just didn't get it right. And the Olympics is just such a funny thing. They just didn't come my way. And then the Olympics in '72, which was in Munich, that was. I'm trying to think. That Mary Monarch had fizzled out by then, and I was with Sporting Ford, and sponsorship had been taken away. So obviously the horse went as well. So I didn't really have although he was asked to go on to the Olympics because he was Olympic material. And I'd met my ex-husband Errol the year before in '71, and we were sort of juggling whether marriage was more important than me trying to get into the Olympics. And so marriage
in hindsight, you might say that the Olympics was more important.
Of course. But you know, when you meet somebody and you fall in love and you get stupid.
Yeah. Incredible story. And I mean, let's put it into context. Some of the contemporaries of that era that you were up against, you're talking about the David Brooms, the Harvey Smiths, Pat Smythe, Marion Coates. I mean, big names.
Oh, yes. Well, Pat Smythe was, I'm not quite sure why, but she came and lived in my mother's place when the war broke out. I think my mother and her mother knew, and Pat Smythe learned to ride with my mother on her Argentine polo ponies and the Argentine trainer. And then when the war finished, one of these polo ponies went to Pat Smythe. I don't really know why, because I was far too young to know. But she taught it to jump, and she got onto the British show jumping team, the only woman to do so other than men in the army, at the end of the 1940s, I suppose. And she made her name there, entirely from herself and her Argentinian polo trainer that my mother brought into the country. And then she, she always rode, funnily enough, in the beginning anyway, in the bottom rein of a Pelham, which is what the polo ponies were ridden in. they didn't have two reins, they only just had the bottom rein, and she used to show jump like this. And it brought her success in the beginning. And of course, she used to ride with a tight standing martingale and the bottom rein of a pelham. But it worked for her in those days. Horses were a bit different.
During this time of merely a monarch, my first question is: in your time in Britain, at the peak of your sport, was he the best you had?
Oh yes, absolutely, far and away. He was actually nominated. I can't remember where the nomination came, but there was some nomination done of the top 50 horses of the 1900s, in other words, the 20th century. Top 50 horses, not show jumpers. And they nominated race horses, everything, all over. And he was one of them, nominated as one of the top horses of that century. So, I mean, that's how good he was.
Were there other horses that you knew of that had won 5-star events like Burghley or Badminton and then gone on to show jump at top level as well?
No.
Right, welcome back everybody. Sorry about that, a little bit of a technical glitch on the Sunday evening with Eskom power dipping, and anyway, these things happen, but we're back. We are thoroughly enjoying. I must say, I'm riveted. This is the incredible story of my guest, Anneli Wucherpfennig, formerly, of course, Drum and Hay. And we're talking about the days when you were Drum and Hay. We haven't got to the Wucherpfennig days yet, but when the power went down and we stopped recording, we were talking about world rankings. And in those days, were there world rankings? Because you must have been one of the best lady riders, if not riders in general, in the world in your day, in those times of merely a monarch when you were dominating.
I didn't think of myself as that at all. I always thought I was sort of got so much to learn. I was pretty, I don't know, I suppose it's not my style to be big-headed. I always think I was sort of, could have been better. But I was fully aware that I had a super horse. I suppose in hindsight, I probably was good, but I didn't really think of it at the time. I've got two photographs here, which might be of interest.
I'd love to see them.
From my eventing days.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I've written about that, do I?
A little bit back, little bit back, little bit back. Yes, a little bit forward. Is that you?
That's me. When I was.
You look young.
Before I could read or write. And then this one. This is the famous, well, the horse I was telling you about called Freya.
Yes, go back a little bit back. Okay, people can just see my, yes, there.
This was the 3-day event where I had no training, the first European Championship.
Unbelievable.
That jump was 8 foot wide.
This is you when you were 16, before you were even supposed to be riding in that event.
Yeah.
Gave that jump a little bit of height, huh?
I remember she took off a stride too soon, and I can remember my heart being in my mouth, but she made it. She was very brave, but we were ignorant. Amazing.
And tell me, in those years of merely a monarch, we're talking European Championships. What are the big? Were there Nations Cups? Did you get capped as a? Did you get your British colours?
Oh yes, many times. I rode. I can't remember them all, but I rode in a lot. I mean, I was sort of the queen bee for a year or two. But I didn't. You know, I was never big-headed. I don't think. I hope I wasn't. I always realised that I was as successful as I was because of quality of my horse. But then, I was always quite hungry. Probably because I hadn't had any money, so I had to win in order to survive. And I think in a funny sort of way, it helped me, although if I had a child of my own, I wouldn't want to let it struggle like I had to struggle. But I think in a funny sort of way, it did me good.
Yeah, I mean, it
I
made
really,
it made you as competitive as you were. But I mean, I don't agree when you say, it was the quality of the horse. Yes, was the quality of the horse, but like you've just said, you didn't have the money. You didn't go and buy the made horse. You made the horse. You found the horse. You
he had
trained the
to,
horse.
yeah, no, sure. He had to be good. I mean, every horse I had to be good because I couldn't afford for it not to be.
Mm.
But I think I probably had quite a good sense of how far I could push horses. Um, Amazingly, before we did this sort of interview, I was just trying to check up all my eventing time, and I never actually had a fall eventing. And I didn't, I wasn't the sort of a gang-ho rider. I was careful, but I was made sure that things went right. But I wasn't wild, although
Mm.
people might have thought so, because sometimes in jump offs I can look as if I was a bit wild, but I wasn't really.
Emily, on those Nations Cups in those days, who were your team members? Was it the David Brooms and?
With David Broom, Harvey Smith, I didn't quite, I did overlap with Pat Smythe just for a year or two. And then I'm trying to think, Peter Robeson, of course. Oh my goodness me. All sort of right the way through the 60s, because I got onto the show jumping team in 62. Can you believe it? I was on the British show jumping team in Rotterdam the same year that I won badminton. I mean, it was, in hindsight, it was really quite crazy. You don't do that sort of thing nowadays.
You were young then. Well, how old were you when you won badminton?
Good question. I suppose I was 23. I was starting to think I was getting a bit old.
Crazy. Now, did you obviously in all the years when you were capped for Britain and the Queen being a horse lover and a lover of horse sports, you must have met her again. Did you? If so, did you ever remind her that you were that young girl that refused to sell her your horse?
No, not when you talk to the Queen. It's all very regal, and you sort of, you say the minimum. You don't really have cozy chats. Not when you're with the Queen. I mean, maybe some people do, but no, not my sort of. You bow and scrape, and
I think the day when you refused to sell your horse, I think she was secretly in your corner.
Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. Princess Anne is always funny enough. When I won one of the world championships here in South Africa, I think they were called the World Championships, and the winner of the whole thing, it was many countries in the world took place, and the winner had to get the prize from the AGM of the FEI, which was held in Florida. And I was the winner that year, and I went to Florida to get my prize, and Princess Anne was the head of the FEI in those days, and she gave a little speech before the whole presentation, and she said that she had always admired me most of everybody and wanted to aspire to be like me when she was eventing, which I was very flattered about. But
Wow.
she obviously had followed me a little bit. Yeah, she had. She was a tough girl. She was a good rider.
That's an incredible compliment. Let's move on to South Africa. When did you first come here? What was your first outing? Is that when you decided you wanted to make it a home, or was it only when you met Errol? Did you meet Errol on your first time you came here?
Yes, I mean, hindsight is got wisdom. I was invited to ride in 71 at whatever it was, some international show here in Johannesburg. And I had planned to fly straight from Rotterdam, where I was competing, and come straight on to Johannesburg. And it was a guy called Chris Coldry who was organising the show, and he'd organised me about 6 months before, and I'd accepted. And when the time got nearer, I was getting quite tired because I'd been to a lot of shows, and I thought, why on earth do I want to go to Johannesburg when I was so exhausted? But anyway, I did. I had to stick to my word. And then just to crown it all, I had quite a bad fall in Rotterdam and hurt my back. But I had to come because I was on a team of, it was called the Rest of the World team. There was 3 other riders from different countries. We were making up a team to take on South Africa. I had to, so I got on the plane pretty crippled and pretty miserable. And then when I got here, I met Errol, and Errol was very much of a ladies' man, and just, it was, in hindsight, of course, it was really stupid, but at the time you're in control of yourself always. And so it was decided that either he had to come to England if we were going to stay together, or I had to come here. And I thought, well, I've done quite a lot of show jumping now in my day, and I'd sort of seen a lot of countries and been around the world. Maybe it was time to hang up my boots and maybe have a family and whatever. And so that was the decision I took. So I came to South Africa. I sold my horses in England, and I came here and started up again. But then I didn't have a family for whatever reason, and the marriage with Errol wasn't all as I'd planned. Wasn't all bad, but it wasn't very easy. But I started show jumping again. So I sort of had 2 or 3 years, I think, where it was a bit lean here because I didn't have anything to ride. And then I had to build up horses in this country to try and be sort of competitive again. And yeah, and luckily I was still able to keep doing it. Even now I'm doing it still a little bit.
What age were you when you first came out here?
You know, I was getting quite old. I think I was about 31. That's why I was thinking it was time that I finished with this competing, you know. So yeah, because people, you know, people didn't sort of go on being sporting achievers so much, even in those days. I mean, nowadays things are different. I mean, you go on much longer and you can make it a career. In those days, it wasn't really a career, although I did have good sponsorships. Yeah.
But you did go on. So tell me about how many years were you with Errol? It was only while you were married, and then you moved away with that period, and some of the horses that you had during that period, and then of course the brilliant Stormfinch, Quattro, Olympian. There's just so much more to tell.
Well, I did. You see, I was very lucky. I mean, Errol, in fairness, he bought me a horse about a year after we were married. It was a little horse called Black Greco. He was only 15 too, but he was a little tiger, and I did very well with him, and I won a few Grand Prix with him. And then I sort of got other horses. I can't really remember them all, but Errol was starting to sort of have his energy in other places, and the marriage was getting a bit rocky. But I sort of got more and more involved with the horses to try and keep myself sane, I think. And then I had very good horses. They were all thoroughbreds, which I hadn't really ridden before. But I had a very good horse called Nebraska, and I bought a very good horse from Harry Kaganoff. Can't remember. Seville, and they were amazing. I mean, I won the SA Grand Prix with Seville, and Nebraska was show jumper of the year for 2 years, and you know, they were just good. Then I got Stormfinch after that, and he was fantastic. But I had a lot of good ones between, and yeah, somehow or other I just had to survive. And although the marriage didn't sort of help, but I was sort of a fighter to keep my head above water. And somehow or other I managed to get good sponsorships from various areas and people or whatever, and we kept going.
And all these horses that you jumped to the top on, were any of them made before you got them, or you produced them all yourself? The likes of Stormfinch, Nebraska.
Half and half. They were a little bit. The Stormfinch had a grounding, and Nebraska had a grounding, but I had to sort of remake them a little bit. But they were sort of proven. But I did get some others which weren't so proven. It depended on the, if I couldn't afford them, I had to buy them ready off the track for nothing, or more or less nothing. So I had a mixture, but I did, actually, funnily enough, Errol helped me with buying Seville, even though our marriage was nearly coming to an end, but he did assist me. And he was quite expensive. Not huge, but in today's terms, but he was quite expensive, but he won everything. He was SA Grand Prix, SA champion, and he was just an amazing horse. He just never did anything wrong. But sadly, I only had him a year. I got him blood tested because he wasn't looking so wonderful. His coat was a bit dull and whatever. And the vet said he was anemic. And the best thing is to give him iron injections. And so I said, well, okay, let's go ahead. And he did that. And luckily, the first injection he gave himself, horse was dead in 2 minutes, dropped dead.
Oh.
Went straight to his heart. And that was the end of it.
Oh, no.
They said it can happen with iron injections. I don't think you can do it nowadays, iron injections, but in those days it was quite fashionable. So that was terrible. But I was very lucky with other horses. I had very good sponsorships from various people. I had the white horse that White Horse Whiskey used in the adverts, and that kept me going for a bit. And a lot of car firms were sponsoring me.
What do you mean? The royalties off of the adverts and doing the adverts? That
he was the horse they used in the advert, and they sponsored me because of being used. We called him White Horse Whiskey, and so I competed on him as White Horse Whiskey.
And Anneli, if you don't mind me asking, why the decision after Errol to stay? Why didn't you go back to England? Family was there.
Good question, but I'd already got my roots into this country, and I'd built up horses, and I'd sort of left everything in Britain, and I hadn't really got anything to go back to. I didn't have a home in England, and I thought, no, I got more of a home in South Africa, so I decided to stay in South Africa. And decisions, whether it was the right one or not, who knows, but I'm glad I did.
But you did regroup, and there were stable yards along the way, and you built a career. Well, I mean, you already had a career, but you built a business. Tell us about some of those years. What was your business? You were coaching a lot, producing a lot of horses, selling some horses, and really you remained in top-level competition for a long time.
Well, don't forget, when I was married to Errol, he had a property in Lone Hill, and when he went off with another lady, he said I could. This property had stables, and it was about 7 acres, and he wasn't kind enough to give it to me. He said I could buy it from him, which somehow or other I managed, and so that it became mine. And so I stayed on the property, and I managed to get sponsorships from various firms, whether it was White Horse Whiskey or whatever. I mean, I had lots of different. The last one was from Audi. It was the best one. I had that for 9 years, and all the horses had the Audi prefix, and it kept me going. But I had to win. I mean, I had to be good enough to justify it. So we somehow or other we kept going. It was hard, but we kept going.
But you you won everything. The Derby eluded you for a long time, but correct me if I'm wrong, you won everything else. There were South African championships and outdoor Grand Prix and indoor Grand Prix, and you were always there. I mean, like I said at the beginning of this interview, all the other riders and top riders, the Gondas, the Peter Gotses, they all said that you were the ultimate competitor. There was that there was never a class, and I'm not just talking the big classes. I'm talking you won everything. And if you went to, it was a 5-day show. Anneli was winning on 5 days of the 5-day show. You were just relentless in your winning streak, in your competitiveness.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I was hungry. I had to win to survive. And that was the task that was given to me. Maybe it made me more competitive. I don't really know. I can't really answer it, but I suppose I was competitive. I mean, yeah, if I was challenged, I would always take it on. And yeah, and luckily I was able to keep going. I had a lot of wins, I suppose, in hindsight. But I don't really think of it like that. I didn't actually give myself a choice. I had to win. It was I had no choice.
That was what you'd always done. I mean, that was survive. It's like what's come out of this interview. It was survival right from the beginning, right from the days in Scotland as a young girl, right through England. That's how you survived.
I think it probably was a survival thing, and I think probably in a way it benefited me, although it was very unpleasant on many occasions. But it did make you try harder, and maybe when youngsters are handed things on a plate, you're not actually giving them perhaps such a favor. I don't know. Maybe not. What do you think? Do you think it's not always?
I think times have changed.
Yes.
I tend to agree with you. I believe it's the way I was raised. If you want something, you got to work for it. That's just the way I was raised. Yeah.
No,
Tell me about some of these wonderful horses that you had in South Africa, because a lot of people will remember Storm Finch. First of all, tell me about him.
Storm Finch came from Johnny Myberg, and she bought him. I don't know, as a 4-year-old. I think he was either 4 or 5 when I bought him, and he obviously had a very good jump, but he was small. He was only 15.3, and he was quite hot. And he was one of those horses that when you went round a corner, you always disunited behind because he was fizzing so much and that sort of thing. And me, with my dressage upbringing, it drove me mad. So I had to try and get rid of that. And but I had to give and take a lot because he was a bit of a nutcase. But we learned to agree to differ, you know.
And for a small horse, a strong horse, because you always he looked like he took you to a fence.
Yes, he did. But you had to be a little bit precise with him because he didn't like to stand back. And I remember one year I qualified with him for what they call the Mercedes Championship, where the top 4 riders had to swap horses, and he was my horse, and the other riders really battled on him because he was more difficult than I think they realized. It was a bit of
Did you win? Did you win?
I think I did, actually. It was an advantage to me.
I was actually I think I was there the year that you finally won the Derby. Was it 92 or 93? And you were lowest qualifier. You were first to go at the Old Ananda, and your only mistake was on the step where he stopped in the middle. He stopped on the step at the second element. You had to decide 1 or 2, and I think you went for the 1 and he chipped in and then breasted the bales that were going up the step. And you had to turn him around on the step and jump up, and then you went on to jump clear.
I think you're right, but that was on a horse called Fire.
Was that not Storm Finch?
No, it was actually Storm Finch's brother.
Ah.
Jerez, I shouldn't have really ridden him in the Derby, but I got in as the lowest qualifier because he was only just scraped in. So which is why I was number one to go. And then I mean, it was amazing. I think first to go and then stayed in the lead, but he actually didn't win. He came second that year. I won it another year with Stormfinch.
Okay. Were you hungry for the Derby? Because it's one that that eluded you for a long time.
I was, and then I had a very good horse called Say Hello, a white horse, which was also a lunatic. And you had to have a special key to him because he was very difficult to hold him and to cope with him. He was a little horse, very fizzy, came from David Wilkin. And he was top qualifier in the Derby, and I had a good chance of winning on him. And the day before the Derby, I was jumping a young horse in the warm-up arena at the Derby. And we got the warm-up jump all wrong, and somehow or other we crashed into it, and the top of the stand of the warm-up jump was just a metal pipe. It had no top on it, and it swung over and hit me on the top of my lip and cut the whole of my lip right through like that. My lip was hanging down. It was very disgusting. So I went off to hospital and had to have about 10 stitches to put the lip back again. And that was fine. And I woke up from the anesthetic and my lip was back in place and I had a bandage over my mouth. And I don't know how I managed it, but I somehow or other managed to get out of hospital to go and compete in the Derby that next day. And Say Hello was top qualifier, you see. And I had never won the Derby, and I was really quite hungry to try and do it. And I rode him, and he was a strong little horse and quite complicated. And I remember it like yesterday. I got about over halfway round clear, and suddenly my body just went like a piece of tissue paper. I couldn't hold him anymore. I had no power. I was just limp. I had to stop, and it's totally out of character for me to do something like that, but I couldn't.
Well, I mean, it means you are mortal. You had just come out of anesthetic and had an operation the day before. So
yes, the night before.
The night before, yeah. And then of course the wonderful Olympian towards the end of your South African career in the big classes. And I remember the year you were going away with him. I think he had already been booked into quarantine. You had decided to take him overseas. Why the decision to take him overseas? First of all, was he that good?
No, good question. Well, funnily enough, he won nearly everything in South Africa. I was very fortunate. I bought him at a horse and training sale as a 3-year-old off the track, but he was by the same father as Stormfinch, so this Jerez blood was very strong for me to want another one. And anyway, I trained him up, and he became an A grade quite early on. I think he was 5 or 6.
Was he a Favaros? What was he?
Yeah, no, he was a Favaros, but his mother was a Jerez.
Ah, right. Okay.
So, which is what Stormfinch was. And he was a very big 16-3, 17 hand horse, chunky horse, useless racehorse. But and he did have aptitude to jump. And I trained him, and then when I started jumping him in the bigger classes, he was really very special. And a lot of my supporters said, this horse is so good, if you get a chance, you must take him overseas. He's too good for this country. And I think he won the SA Champs. They had the SA Champs in PE, but he was very young. I remember my husband, Trevor, said, no, you mustn't ride him, it's too big, he's not ready for it. Anyway, I didn't listen, and he won it. And then, as a result of that, I thought, no, he really is, because it was one of the Harold Preston's huge horses.
Mm, mm,
And so I got the interesting thing is that it was actually the time when Mandela was coming in and the sports sanctions were being lifted off South African sports people to go overseas.
mm.
And horses were allowed to leave, providing they did the quarantine. So a lot of friends got behind me and put the money up and said, come on, you've got to take this horse overseas and try and get him into the World Championship. And so that's how it's happened. It was very complicated, and I suppose I was quite brave and maybe brainless. But quarantine meant 3 months in America before you could go to Europe,
Yeah.
which was hideous. Those poor horses, they had to go into a stable and you weren't allowed to look at them, and they were just not attended to. Shut up.
Mm.
And so when he came out, he was looking absolutely dreadful. Starey, long coat and thin, and feet not attended to, long feet. And I think he still had the same shoes on that he had when he left South Africa. So he'd been 3 months in quarantine without feet being attended, that sort of thing. So I was in, by the time I got to Europe, he was really very sort of lost a lot of time and ground because of this dreadful quarantine. But we
And how long, what were the World Games or World Championships that you were aiming at, and how far away were they from the time that you came out, that he came out?
3 months. Crazy.
Oh, no.
Not nearly enough. And of course...
No, I mean, they say if you're resting a horse, the amount of time that you rest is going to take the same amount of time to get it back to where it was.
Well, physically, he wasn't ready for it, but mentally, and what we don't realize is that the horses jumping in this country, they're not subjected to crowds and all sorts of goings on that happen in shows in Europe. And you know, when you take a young horse to a show, his eyes are on stalks looking at things he's never seen before, and then the older horses get used to it and they just get blasé. And I remember the first show I rode him at, it was a military show at Aldershot. It was one of the shows before getting him ready for the World Games. And his eyes nearly fell out of his head because, first of all, there was a whole sort of quadrille of soldiers being paraded up and down. And then there was some hackneys trotting up and down in carts. He'd never seen anything like this. And his eyes fell out of his head. And so when we went into the jumping horses, he wasn't concentrated at all on what he had to do. And, you know, he was jumping big courses. So without the concentration, it was impossible. Because he just was so green. He was like a 4-year-old taking it to a show and expecting it to jump a Grand Prix, because with his mind, he wasn't ready. So poor boy, I rode him at the World Champs. It was at the Hague, but he hadn't settled mentally at all. We finished, and I think we got a prize in one task, but it was very hit and miss and horrible. He never really came back into being the horse he was.
And you spent some time overseas back in Europe before you came back to South Africa again.
Yeah, I certainly did. It was so expensive to get there and so complicated that I didn't want to come back immediately, because I wanted to make use of having got there. And I based myself in England for a bit, and then I went to Holland. And somehow or other, I seem to have a habit of doing this. I'd gathered up good horses and started competing, and there were a few people old enough who remembered me, and especially some of the show organisers. And I got invitations to ride at some of the big international shows, the big shows, there's still a lot of it's on invitation, and either you pay a fortune or you get invited. Well, luckily I was still on the invitation list, so I got into quite a lot of the big shows, and I was very lucky like that. And so I travelled around, and I took my horse box with me to go and so I was more mobile, and I stayed with people who were friends and managed to put up, and I managed to help them. It was, yeah, and I'm based in Holland. I stayed in Holland for 11 years, and then I decided that by this time I wasn't competing so much at the top level. I thought either I've got to settle down and go back to England or come back to South Africa, and I decided to come back to South Africa. England was a bit of a closed shop by then because most of the people I knew had died off. So I thought South Africa was probably a better fit.
I'm just going through my head. I'm just wondering about the calls to the show organizers when you phoned and said, "Hi, it's Anneli Wucherpfennig." And who? Anneli Drummond Hay. Ah, did the penny drop?
Well, I must tell you a funny story. There was a judge. I was riding in Vienna, and this judge came and he told me the story against himself. He turned to his co-judge when I came in the ring and he said, "I used to compete against this lady's mother." Well, it wasn't his lady's mother, it was me. So, anyway.
Very good.
You do.
And you brought some horses back with you when you came back to South Africa. When was that? When did you come back? 10 years?
Trying to remember the exact date. I think it was about 2005, 2006. By this time I'd sort of, I have a sort of a habit of buying a young horse and schooling it and whatever. And I bought a couple of warm bloods in Holland. And when I decided to come back, either the horses had to be sold or, I think the idea was to sell them. And so I told a few people that they were sort of young, 4-year-old and a 6-year-old or something. And I'd sort of trained and competed with them a bit. People came to try them, and it upset me so much seeing these idiot riders, well, they seemed like idiots, trying the horses over enormous fences to see if the horses had the ability and wrecking the horses' confidence, and I couldn't stand it. And I thought, no, I can't take this anymore. So I stopped putting them on the market and decided to bring them back here, and somehow or other scraped up enough money to afford to bring them back. So since getting back, I've sort of been living from pillar to post a little bit. I didn't have a property anymore, so I had to just go and stable wherever I could.
And these days you're doing a lot of coaching. Have you always done a lot of coaching, or?
I was doing a lot of coaching, but of course now since this lockdown, I've always forgotten how to do it. So I rather doubt whether it'll ever come back again, because everything's coming to a grinding halt, isn't it? Goodness knows how it's going to get back again. I don't know. So I was, prior to this, I was schooling young horses and selling them and coaching people. But all this is sort of seems to have changed drastically, quite frankly. And whether shows are ever going to be like they were, I really don't know. So I've got two very nice. Well, I've got 6 nice horses actually, young horses. I've got 3 off the track, and 4 off the track actually, and 2 young older ones.
You're still enjoying it.
Yeah, it keeps me going.
Tell me, all those top thoroughbred horses that you had during your career when you were jumping at the top here in South Africa. Quattro was one of my favorites. She was electric. Stormfinch, I loved. Olympian, I loved. Who would you make as the best? Is it possible to say?
Not really, because they all had the qualities and the quirks. I don't think I can. It depended on the situation, and I would think probably the best, if it was really put to me, was that horse Seville that dropped dead from the iron injection. He was just amazing. funny enough, he was belonged to a neighbour of mine when I lived in Pine Slopes, and he was quite a sort of different character. He was sort of over 60 when he decided he wanted to start show jumping. And he was a guy called Harry Kaganoff, and he was a law unto himself. And he bought this horse to race, and it was not much good racing. He liked his racing, and so he brought it back home, and he decided to teach it to jump, and he asked me to come and help him. And the horse was quite stubborn, and I remember he couldn't get it over a little ditch, so I wasn't going to sit on it and be bucked off. So I put it on long reins and drove it over the ditch. And then after that, I sort of had a hand in helping him ride the horse, and he started jumping it. In those days we had a D grade and a C grade and a B grade, and then there were three categories of A grade. I don't know if you remember that. It was, I don't know, it was called medium, national and international. And anyway, Harry rode this horse in the lower grades, and he won everything. I mean, but not very pretty to look at, but the horse sort of plodded around. Looked like a warm blood, but he actually wasn't. And then when you had to get points in order to get up to A grade, and he won his points. And then Harry, being the sort of character he was, he said, no, this horse is so good, I'm not going to ride him in the lower A grades. I'm going to put him straight into the big A grade. Now, he was sort of over 65 and not a very athletic person. And I remember he went to Old Rad Show, having entered this horse in the big A grade classes. And he said if anybody wanted to buy the horse, they'd have to pay 100,000 rand, which is like saying, if you want to buy my horse, you've got to pay 10 million. I mean, it was stupid, you know. And he rode it in I think it was the Grand Prix in Rand Show when it was at Milner Park. And there was I think it was a 5-strider, it was an oxer to oxer or something. And Harry, not having an educated eye, decided he had a big stride over the first oxer and then kept going forward and got there on 4.5 and tried to make the horse jump off the 4th stride. And the horse said, no ways, it's too far off, and put in a quickie and forced him and then jumped it on the 5th stride. And of course, Harry was already taken off and met the horse halfway up and went flying off, catapulted off, and lay flat on his back, lying for dead. And that night he came round to my house and he said, do you want to buy Seville? Because I've decided I'm too old. And that was it. Bought him. Didn't have him vetted or anything. And I took the horse immediately into the big classes and he won everything. He was amazing. But sadly, because he'd been so, I think, badly looked after by Harry and badly nourished, I thought, well, now he's such a superstar horse, I must give him the best. I ended up killing him in kindness. But he was the first Jerez, you see, and then that started me off in that Jerez line. Yeah. Which was Stormfinch.
You are somebody who's ridden top level on both thoroughbreds and the warm bloods. What is your opinion? Can you compare them, or is a good horse despite what its breeding is?
No, I think that, good question. The thoroughbred, I think, is absolutely fantastic, but I think with the courses being what they are today and being so demanding and so technical, I think the warm blood has got more power to be able to come in close to a massive oxer and get over it, not sort of landing. A thoroughbred has to have a little bit of impetus and speed, whereas a warm blood can jump over out of a slower rhythm and more power. So from that point of view, I think they've got to be preferential. But I do think people are very foolish to not persevere with the thoroughbreds more than they do, because the majority of riders aren't good enough to ride in the really big classes. It's quite a small handful, and people are discarding super horses when they should realize that their own talents don't enable them to ride in bigger classes themselves. So I'm a huge supporter of the thoroughbred.
Mm.
And I think, funny enough, I was thinking earlier today, I, the English thoroughbreds that I had before I came here, they weren't as good in their minds as the South African thoroughbreds. And I've been sort of often questioned as to why that should be. And then there was a very good rider called Seamus Hayes, who was quite famous at his time, an Irish rider. And he came out to ride here on a borrowed horse. And I remember discussing with him, he said, these horses are amazing. And I said, well, what do you think it makes them different from the British thoroughbreds or the Irish thoroughbreds? And he said, well, he's been thinking a lot about it. And he's put it down to the African grooms having a better temperament with dealing with the horses to what the European grooms would. They don't scream and yell and shout, and if the horse is trodden on their toe, they pick their toe up and rub it and don't scream at the horse. And I think that it's the African temperament is amazing with the horses. They don't react like the more so-called cultured European people. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. Interesting point. Very interesting. I've never thought about it.
Yeah.
Never thought about it.
So whether it's, but you know, the majority of the horses have started off with black grooms, haven't they? And whether they've been
on that note, I've got to tell you that I've got two guys who work for me that used to be with you. One is Michael Ngwenya, who went overseas with you at Olympia.
Yes.
So he's actually still with me. And then another one is Elfie and Ndlovu, who would have been a very young man when he was with you. So
who's the other one?
Elfie, Temba and Ndlovu, Elfie and Ndlovu. So he worked for you when he was a young man. And they do send their best and speak very highly of you. I wanted to ask you, some of the noticeable changes that you've seen in show jumping over the years, the evolution of show jumping. Where has it come from, and where is it today, and possibly where do you think it's going?
It's far more precise now. You've got to know your flat work properly. I mean, we were very cowboyish in yesteryear. Not that I'm saying everybody was, but there was a lot of cowboy riding, and nowadays it's very refined, and there is a little bit of cowboy sometimes, but generally speaking, it's much more refined. But I think sometimes, in a detriment, people are too precise, and they ride their horses maybe a little like motorbikes, and they don't allow the horse to have the freedom of its own thought. And I think that there's got to be a sort of a happy level where you can allow the horse to have a little bit of its own thoughts, because I think ultimately that's what wins you, if you can allow that horse a bit of freedom. And I can remember watching. I'm trying to think who it was. It was a rider. It was a very big. It was the European Championship actually. There was a last fence. It was a 5-strider to a narrow style, and the time was very tight. And the rider that was last to go took his chances because he didn't think he could do the time otherwise, and he decided to do that last stride on 4, which meant standing back at a stile and with his eyes shut. And he did it. Marcus Fuchs, he was called, Swiss rider. And he did it. And he was a little bit of a wild rider sometimes, but this won in the title. And I think sometimes those things perhaps aren't seen so much nowadays because everything's getting so precise. You know, I remember Ludwig Beerbaum when I won something. I can't remember what show it was, but it was also European or something. And he was riding this horse that he rode in a hackamore, and the hackamore broke. And
that was the Olympics, wasn't it? Classic Touch.
That's right. The Hackmore broke, and he
Mm.
had to shut his eyes and keep going, and he won it.
Mm.
And I think sometimes those situations, maybe when you get so precise, you can't visualize that kind of situation.
Mm.
I don't know, maybe not, I don't know.
Mm. Mm. You have had such an incredible career. You've ridden for Great Britain. You've got your British colours, your South African colours. Are there any other riders that you know that have done that?
I
Or
don't
vice
think
versa even?
I don't think so. I don't know. I'm not very good at following things like that. I don't really sort of compete on that kind of thing.
In your life with horses, I mean, what's been evident throughout this chat is that you've had to work damn hard. You are a survivor, and you've done that. Do you have any regrets along the way, or if you could do anything again, would you do anything differently?
You know, of course there could be regrets. I mean, I shouldn't have got married to Errol, but it wasn't all bad. But you know, I think you don't look backwards and say, "Oh, I wished I hadn't," because it's sort of what makes a negative sort of factor in your life. I think what's happened is it's water under the bridge, and you know, if you start saying, if I hadn't done this and I hadn't done that, where does it end? I think that I always look forward, and if you've made a blups or something, I mean, it's a pity if you had a car crash and because you were stupid, but then I'm not thinking, you know, I just think that generally speaking, what's happened has happened, and you can't look backwards.
Mm. Mm.
So it was, yeah, I mean, I could have sold Mary a Monarch for a big price and not been financially strapped or whatever, you know, but it's all.
Anything perhaps that you wish you had achieved? Olympic Games, being there, would that be one?
I don't have regrets about it because I was philosophical to know that it was all a bit of a cutthroat thing, and you know, I was selected by people who didn't necessarily know what was going on, and not the selectors didn't really know what the cutthroat situation was, and you know, just it was the lack of the draw, and no, I didn't really. I don't think so. I don't. I think it's a negative thing to have regrets.
Mm. Mm. You have had such a wonderful life. I hope I know how well Trevor writes. Has he written your memoirs? Is that on the? Are you planning to?
You know, I thought when this lockdown period, it's a good time to get going. So I got a pad of paper and got everything ready. I've written one line. I just can't get going.
Why wouldn't Trevor sit down with you? This has to be recorded, and I know if that, and he better do it because people are going to watch this, and I've got a few writer friends myself who are very horsey. I know one, maybe two people who would just love to get sink their teeth into your life story. So you better tell that husband of yours that he, you know, now's the time. If ever there was a time, it's now.
You're right, Aidan. I agree. You know, I've had bits and pieces of writing myself. I mean, I used to be a correspondent for Horse and Hound, and then I used to write for the newspaper, and then I did a little bit in South Africa. I wrote for the Star for a bit and whatever. But it doesn't always come to me easily, and I don't really like writing about myself. Somebody wrote a book about me once, years and years ago, before I came to South Africa. But I was so disgusted the way it made it sound like a sort of a women's, I don't know, beauty magazine or something. It was dreadful. I didn't like it. But,
It's been a wonderful privilege for me to chat to you about your life, Anneli. It really has been quite remarkable and eye-opening, and I've been in awe at some of the things that you've told me. So thank you for that. Thank you for all of the memories that you've given all your fans and horsewomen and horsemen alike. And we hope to see you on the other side of this and see you back at shows.
Thank you. Well, my horse will be ready. I don't know how good I'll be, but he'll be okay.
Once again, thank you and love to Trevor, and have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Aidan. Thanks for being such a good questionnaire.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks.